The opinions expressed by the host and guests in this show are not necessarily the views of Children's Health Defense.
Good morning, Children's Health Defense. It is my great honor today to welcome Neville Hodgkinson, an author and journalist who's written extensively not only about AIDS, which we'll talk about right now, but also about what happened during COVID. Neville, welcome.
Great to be with you, Mary.
So we're here to talk in part about this terrific film that Joan Shenton did, The Great AIDS Debate, Search for Solutions. And let's talk about that first, and then we'll sort of tie this to COVID. But I've just watched the film where she has a penetrating, thoughtful conversation with then the president of South Africa, where he was really questioning the mainstream AIDS narrative. Can you talk a little bit about that interview, why it's important, what was its significance?
It was such a tragedy that it was shown across Africa. It was such a tragedy that no one elsewhere saw it at the time, because he was a great statesman, and he was actually unseated because of his stand on AIDS. It was a terrible thing, and we saw some of this with COVID. If someone is speaking out against very, very big, powerful commercial and other interests, things can happen to them that will actually deprive them of their position. And Mbeki, he learned that there was a critique about the HIV theory of AIDS, that it was caused by this infectious, sexually transmitted virus. He learned that the drug treatments that had been promoted for it were very questionable, if not extremely dangerous. And he started to question. And it was just the questioning was absolutely lethal, or would have been if it had been allowed to continue, for the HIV theory of AIDS, because in my view, it's a real myth. But what happened was that he learned that there were these questions. He saw it as almost like a post-colonial thing, that Africa was being made the scapegoat for this disease that had begun in a small group of gay men in San Francisco, New York, maybe London. And the theory was put forward that a virus had somehow come out of Africa and had been spread around the world. And so he was suspicious about this story anyway, because of that feeling that Africa always gets the blame for this kind of thing. And so he started questioning a bit. And you'll see in the interview that Joan got with him, he's such a level-headed guy. He was a really good president. He would have been wonderful if he'd stayed as president for South Africa. But instead, I don't know if it was intelligence agencies, but really there was a campaign to unseat him. There was the Durbin AIDS conference, and the scientists there, there's a sort of big movement of HIV AIDS, they organized what they called the Durbin Declaration. I think it was organized by Nature magazine, the British science magazine. And they got thousands of people to sign it, saying the cause of AIDS is absolutely clear and it's dangerous and wrong to question it. Just like happened with COVID, actually, when people started to question COVID policies. And what happened was, soon after that, he was unseated. The RAND plummeted. There were headlines in my former newspaper, the Sunday Times, something like, Mbeki wants AIDS babies to die in pain. And there was another one in the Observer, normally a respectable publication in the UK, saying something very similar within a week of each other. There was a concerted effort by some dark forces to unseat him. And it's such a tragedy.
It's a tragedy. Yeah, he comes across so well in that interview, and he talks about, the horror of suppression of debate and science, that you have to have free speech in science and in politics as well. But the film also shows Joan traveling across Africa and interviewing people and showing scientists like Luc Montagnier, the Nobel Prize winner, saying there's a lot of things contributing to health problems in India, in Africa, primarily poverty, malnutrition, lack of access to medicine. What do you think of that documentary footage in the film?
It was a first, and it was very, very important. Actually, I was able to confirm it for myself. I was slow to understand. I was working when AIDS started. I was working as medical correspondent on the London Sunday Times, and I found it a bit suspicious when um, it was announced that it was all attributable to this deadly virus. But I went along with it. I went to the Washington AIDS conference. It was like a big religious rally. Everyone was lots of money and hope that we've got this, and we're kind of cross carriers for the world, and all of these sort of very strong feelings running around. And I came back feeling, yes, this is a real problem, because there was said to be a long time lag between when you were infected through sex or through blood and when you would actually become ill. This was the story. So lots of people were said to be in the pipeline of death with this. And we had huge campaigns in the UK warning everyone, to be careful. There was a gravestone campaign, many things like this. But Joan actually put me on to the fact that the story was I'd left the Sunday Times for a couple of years in another job. And I went back as their science correspondent. And the predictions that I'd been writing about weren't happening. There
Yeah.
was no heterosexual spread. The drugs weren't working. There was no vaccine. There were all sorts of things that had been said to be imminent. They weren't happening. And there were concerns that the drugs were proving extremely toxic. And I started to investigate. And it was actually, when you've written about something in a kind of passionate way, warning the public about this, it's quite hard to turn back on that. But eventually I did, and I started with the editor supported me. I wrote about 30 or 40 articles, maybe more, challenging all sorts of different aspects of the HIV theory. And after a bit, the editor said, Neville, yes, everyone's starting to agree that there's no heterosexual epidemic. It's just the original risk group. But what about Africa? You've got millions in the pipeline of death there. Go and tell me what's happening. So I spent several weeks in Africa. I went through several countries. And I remember meeting the health minister in Zimbabwe. He told me HIV, fear of HIV, is doing more damage than this purported virus. But the biggest amazing interview was with a chap called Krynen, who, with his wife, had gone out to start a charity for AIDS babies. And he'd been hugely successful because he said all villages are dying and all the rest. And he was flown around the world by the AIDS people. He got lots of money in. And when I called on him, he'd got about 7,000 children on his books. And they were doing fine because he'd discovered that the HIV story, the test could give very different results, that when he treated these children for the traditional African illnesses, often associated with malnutrition, they would thrive. So AIDS had disappeared from his lexicon. HIV had disappeared from his lexicon, and he was doing far better than in neighboring regions. But when I reported this with a big thing, it created such a storm, huge storm, that Nature tried to stop us from publishing any more articles. They contemplated picketing our offices. It's amazing, right?
Wow.
Amazing. So Joan was an absolute pioneer in all of this, and she's been so patient. She's suffered so much suppression and censorship.
Well, we're so proud to have a platform for her films that are as timely now as they were when she first put them out.
It's fabulous. Yeah, it's
Which
great.
which brings me to COVID. So you recently in 2022 published a book comparing AIDS and COVID. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, because when COVID started, it was reminding me so much of what I'd seen with AIDS, that, the fear mongering, the suppression of effective approaches, which we saw, with ivermectin and so forth, the promises of a vaccine. The difference was, in my opinion, because I've followed this for 40 years now, and I do believe that the HIV story is a complete myth. It was a mistaken from the start. It does not exist. There's a group of scientists in Australia who spent decades analyzing every detail of the story, and they've totally refuted the HIV theory. But they're prevented from being published. Well, there was one. I'm going back to AIDS, but there was one episode I must just tell you about that. A few years back, there was quite a respectable journal, peer-reviewed, that had accepted 2 of their articles that would have blown the lid off all this. And Elsevier, the publishers, told the editor, "You can't publish this." They heard about it. It was in the pipeline. And the editor said, "Well, I'm going to. This is good stuff. It's been peer-reviewed. I want it to be out there." So they fired him and brought in an editor who rejected the articles. That's the level of censorship that this issue has suffered.
Oh yeah. I
Yes,
mean,
so
yeah.
when COVID started, I saw just the same thing happening to people who questioned, like the Great Barrington Declaration and others who were questioning the policies. They were silenced.
Yeah. No, I think your book, How HIV/AIDS Set the Stage for the COVID Crisis, it did. It was really probably before COVID. It was the only global pandemic, so to speak, right? Everybody around the world was supposed to be afraid of contracting HIV, and they were supposed to have it inhibit any kind of sexual contact or other, intimate contact. And you were supposed to use these faulty PCR tests as the only way to check whether or not you were HIV positive. And then, as you say, there was this kind of long latency period, allegedly, during which you would be supposed to take sort of, I guess, basically chemotherapy drugs that were extremely toxic.
Yeah, the AZT was a disaster. Some consider that it killed tens of thousands of gay men and hemophiliacs. It was an absolute disaster.
I was just looking it up. It's not still on the market, is it, Neville?
I believe the ego of the people involved in work like this is so great, they'll never admit mistakes unless they're forced to. I remember when studies came out, careful studies demonstrating that it was worse than useless, but the manufacturer this was at the Berlin AIDS conference, staged a big effort to kind of rehabilitate it in people's minds, to downplay the findings. And I believe some of the cocktails of drugs given to AIDS patients include a tiny dose, probably harmless in itself.
It's generic. I think it's not called AZT, but it's still essentially, it's still being done. Well, what do you want our viewers to take from this film about AIDS in Africa right now, Neville?
Well, I feel that Africa has suffered most from this illusion that was cooked up by Western science. And I feel that they're owed an apology, they're owed an inquiry, they're owed a proper scientific examination. Now, that may be asking for too much, but if the scientists come under pressure from others, such as Children's Health Defence, from maybe even the gay community, because the gay community, one good thing that came out of the HIV story was that it sort of democratized AIDS. To begin with, it was very clear that it was associated with a tiny minority of gay men who were leading a very, very risky, biologically risky lifestyle. And in the first 3 or 4 years, it was a right-wing administration in the States, and it was being dismissed as a gay plague, even though people were ill and dying. And that led to a terrific, suddenly, as it was clear it wasn't going away, and especially because gay men had been fighting so hard for years for acceptance instead of that awful kind of homophobic attitudes that society used to have. So they feared that this was going to mean an awful setback for the gay lib movement. So when a virus theory came along, it was hugely attractive because it meant that everyone was at risk, and the gay men had just been the first and unlucky enough to catch this virus from the jungle or whatever it came from first. But eventually everyone would be at risk. So that brought everyone into the story, and it meant that the sort of acceptance of gay lifestyles didn't suffer that setback. And we've seen today, how a gay lifestyle is considered a perfectly reasonable option. So that's a plus that's come from the story. But I feel as if the gay community themselves having benefited so much in that sense from this false idea, should now look properly at this, because they're still suffering and to some extent. There's still people being diagnosed HIV positive on the basis of fraudulent tests. So it's like not a death sentence anymore, but it's still a very unpleasant thing to hear. So I would love to see the gay community, others come together to force a rethink on this, and with especially with a view to an apology to Africa, for which is now where most of the HIV cases and deaths are said to occur, and that's nonsense. Actually, you know, when this came out, about 1993, I think the population was 700 million in Africa, and it was said that HIV is going to decimate the continent. Today, it's 1.5 billion. It's more than doubled. So all of that was nonsense. But it's a lot of money goes through it, and a lot of money still hangs on it.
Right. Yes, as President Mbeki says, profit is a big driver of all that's happening with this. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us. I look forward to speaking with you again. Maybe we can go into greater depth in your book about the comparison between AIDS and COVID, because it's so important. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Mary. All the best.
This is horrible. My parents are condemned to poison my kids.
Canadian mother Sophie Brassard has tested positive on an HIV test. She didn't want to give her children the AIDS drug AZT because she believes it's toxic. Her children have been taken away by the authorities, and Sophie's parents are now legally bound to administer the drug.
Oh, I miss them so much. And I'm so scared that permanent damage is going to be caused to them.
In South Africa, many are clamoring to be given AZT. But in other countries, some HIV-positive pregnant mothers are so worried about AZT's toxicity that they've refused to give it to their children, resulting in legal actions against them.
I can hardly begin to describe how horrific I find the idea of the medication AZT being given to pregnant women and to newborn babies. I've seen the effects of it on adult men and adult women, and it's a very strong drug, it's very toxic.
This HIV test-positive mother's rejection of AZT and refusal to test her baby for HIV went to the High Court in the United Kingdom. The judgment went against her, and the judge ordered her to test the child. She fled the country with her partner and baby, and they are now fugitives. This mother, like Sophie, is challenging the fundamental beliefs about AIDS. New doubts are rising up about the causes and treatment of AIDS. South Africa is in the middle of an important re-evaluation about what has been described as the greatest plague the world has known, AIDS. Today, there are many scientists and communities around the world who profoundly challenge the idea that a virus, HIV, causes AIDS. Their voices have seldom been heard. In Pretoria, South Africa, President Thabo Mbeki is bringing together an international expert panel to allow a wider range of opinions to be heard.
Because all of us have been, as it were, brought up on an orthodox view. There are certain things that one thought one knows. HIV equals AIDS equals death. And one of the things that became clear, and actually rather disturbing, was the fact that there was a view that was being expressed by people whose scientific credentials you can't question. I'm not saying that they're necessarily correct, but it seemed to me that there had been a determined effort to exclude their voice, to silence it.
I've been reporting on the unfolding of the AIDS debate since 1986 in a series of documentaries allowing some of the experts that have been marginalized a voice. One of the earliest dissenting voices was that of molecular biologist Professor Peter Duesberg, member of the United States National Academy of Sciences. Through a series of published papers, he has stated that it's not an HIV or human immune virus that causes AIDS, and that AZT is toxic. AIDS was not infectious, he said, and in Africa people were dying not of HIV but of poverty, malnutrition, dirty water, and the old diseases like malaria and TB that go untreated. This led our team to travel across Africa in 1993, east to west, to Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and Uganda. Our purpose was to find out if people were really dying in high numbers, and of what. In Rakai village, the total breakdown of the medical services was all too apparent. We visited the local hospital in this so-called epicenter of AIDS and found a sorry scene. Not a single AIDS patient, only an empty ward. No nurses, no doctors, only one tiny baby suffering from malaria convulsions, surrounded by her silent family. We then found the only member of staff who got up from her sickbed to speak to us.
I work as a midwife. And I also help in the treatment of other patients. Now I'm sick.
What do you have?
I have malaria.
Lack of staff and medicines at these local hospitals and dispensaries has meant that sick people simply stay in their own homes. But Nurse Maxentia did agree to show us the medicines cabinet, stocked with some drugs supplied free under the World Health Organization Essential Drugs Program. However, under a new cost-sharing scheme, villagers are now asked to pay a fixed rate for them, which for most means going without. Africa has been blamed for the spread of AIDS around the world, but statistics for AIDS in Africa have been inflated because most AIDS is diagnosed through symptoms alone, without an HIV test. Many people are wrongly identified. Some TB cases are wrongly called AIDS. Dr. Martin Okoton Wang is a TB specialist in Kampala, Uganda.
A patient who has TB and is HIV positive would appear exactly the same as a patient who has TB and is HIV negative. Clinically, both patients could present with prolonged fever. Both patients present with a loss of weight, marked loss of weight actually. Both patients would present with prolonged cough, and in both cases, the cough could equally be productive. Now, therefore, clinically, I cannot differentiate the two.
In Kagera, Tanzania, Lucy is a frightening example of wrong diagnosis. She was diagnosed HIV positive in an unconfirmed screening test. She was ostracized by her community and became very ill. NGO worker Philippe Krynen and his wife took her into their care, and she was returned to health.
It's very seldom you see people who have been stigmatized with AIDS who are not dying a few months later. So Lucy was one of the first persons who, because we didn't support the AIDS tag on her, recovered and was the proof to the community that you can recover from such episodes.
Ninavyofanya kazi na ninavyojisikia hali yangu ni nzuri kama mwanzoni nilivyokuwa kabla sijaumwa.
What would you like to see happen?
Labda nategemea hapo baadaye kuzaa watoto.
A few months later, Lucy tested negative 3 times running and is now happily back in her community. As more and more publicity was given to the possible heterosexual spread of AIDS, and the flames of plague terror were fanned, the issue of the drug AZT, marketed as a therapy for AIDS, came to the fore. AZT was licensed in 1987 through a multi-center trial in the USA. Those trials have been described as deeply flawed by AIDS researcher John Lauritsen, who studied the US Food and Drug Administration papers, which were acquired through the Freedom of Information procedure.
This study was incredibly uncontrolled and sloppy. Violations of protocol were widespread, and I might add that protocols are the rules of the game for a study. So if you violate the rules of a game, you are cheating.
In utter desperation, I took AZT. It made me ill. I went through that process 5 times. I was never on it for more than a month, but my partner, Kevin, persisted, and he died.
6 years later, Michael is in good health and still actively opposing the marketing of AZT. By 1993 in London, the debate about false AIDS statistics and damage from AZT had spilled out onto the streets. There was strong protest about the Penta trials across Europe, involving giving AZT to pregnant African women and their babies. This child's mother felt she hadn't been given enough information.
They test him. They will tell me the results in 1 month's time, but I'm worried he should be given the AZT treatment, and I need more information about it.
Maryland Bazara from Uganda is a community worker with African families in London.
People suffering. These side effects are so strong from this medicine AZT. They're losing their muscles, they have headaches, they have diarrhea and all this. Most of them were not told about the side effects. So they need more information.
The debate went to Parliament in that same year, and George Galloway MP tabled a series of searching questions.
If people knew that this highly toxic drug was being administered to potentially hundreds of small children, as I say, most of them black, most of them without a voice, their parents without a voice in British society, then I think that these tests would be stopped.
There was little change in the next 5 years until the matter was raised again in the House of Lords in 1999. Information that HIV testing is not reliable was becoming more public, and the problem of what was being tested for was under scrutiny. Had HIV ever been properly isolated? Continuum magazine, edited by Hugh Christie, published an interview with HIV co-discoverer Professor Luc Montagnier, in which he stated that HIV has never been purified, an essential step in designing reliable tests for any virus.
Well, of course we looked for it. We saw some particles, but they didn't have the morphology of retroviruses.
He later said,
I repeat, we did not purify.
It was startling that Professor Montagnier decided to acknowledge in his interview with Jamel Tahi in Continuum that as far back as 1983, his team were not able to purify anything that you might call HIV, despite what he termed a Roman effort. So who should be surprised that when the same thing was attempted by expert laboratories in Germany and the United States, who published their results in the journal Virology, what they found was proteins and cellular debris.
At the Royal Perth Hospital, Western Australia, Dr. Valander Turner explains that without proteins from purified virus, HIV testing could produce countless wrong results.
If there is such a thing as an AIDS-causing retrovirus, then its unique body parts, that is, its proteins, should only be found in HIV-positive individuals and individuals who have AIDS. But this is not the case. All the principal HIV proteins have been found in all manner of cells from healthy human beings who are HIV negative.
Also in Perth, senior AIDS researcher Eleni Eliopoulos has published numerous scientific papers on the disturbing fact that no scientist has ever collected a pure sample of what people call HIV.
There is no way to test for HIV. This is because all the tests are based on indirect markers, none of which has been validated by proving that the markers are positive only when the virus is present.
The only type of test routinely used in England and Africa is an ELISA antibody test. It reacts if a person's blood has enough antibodies that bind with a set of test kit proteins, proteins still marketed as belonging only to HIV. If it reacts, the color density changes. These changes are a matter of degree, high or low, not yes or no. Peter Nichols is a 25-year-old gay man. He volunteered to take part in a research project coordinated for Channel 4. His blood was tested on 3 HIV test kits commonly used by laboratories. The blood samples were run through the kits twice by London University Medical School under different code numbers. Each time Peter's blood tested positive. But several weeks later, Peter tested negative at St Mary's Hospital, West London, and again negative at the Royal Free in North London. How did he feel about these conflicting results?
Confused in a way, obviously glad that now, having received 2 sets of negative results, I'm obviously fairly confident that I'm HIV negative now. But confused as to why I would receive a positive result in the first place from the experiment that we did. And how many other false positive results are there floating around that people don't know about?
Professor Etienne de Haven pioneered the electron microscopy of retroviruses at the Sloan Kettering Institute, New York. Today, he's highly critical of the research into so-called HIV.
There is a most urgent need to redirect research funding. Funds should go to laboratories working on other ideas totally independent from HIV and no longer restricted to laboratories working on a hypothesis which has never been proven.
A sense that new information could bring real solutions to AIDS will be driving President Thabo Mbeki's international panel. High on the agenda will be the issue of AZT and pregnant women.
Last year, you were reported as saying in Parliament that you were concerned about the giving of AZT to pregnant mothers. Why were you concerned?
Well, because lots of questions had been raised around the question of the toxicity of the drug. It was very serious. We have a responsibility as a government to determine matters of public health, and therefore we can take decisions. We have to take decisions that impact directly on human beings. And it seemed to me that where doubts had been raised, questions had been raised around these toxicity questions, and the efficacy even of AZT and other drugs, that it was necessary again to go into these matters because it wouldn't sit easily on one's conscience to discover that you had been warned that there could be danger, and nevertheless you went ahead and said, despite the danger, let's dispense these drugs.
Some AIDS doctors say that the evidence is overwhelming that HIV is the cause of AIDS and that AZT is of benefit. What is your comment on that?
Well, I say that why don't we bring all points of view about those matters together, let them sit around the table, discuss all of this, produce such evidence as there may be, and let's see what the outcome of all of that discussion is, which is why this international panel that we're talking about, they may very well be correct. But I think that if they are correct and they are convinced about their correctness, it ought to be, it would be a good thing for them to demonstrate to those who are wrong that they are wrong.
People say that you're not keen on giving AZT to pregnant women. I'm personalizing this, of course, because it's too expensive and in some ways you're seen as penny pinching. What do you reply to them?
Well, that surely must be a consideration for anybody who decides that this drug must be given in this, like, to, as it were, stop these transmissions, again, as it said, from mother to child transmissions. It's extremely costly. That's something that would have to be taken into account. But you see, I'm saying that we also need, in that context, to answer questions. This particular question about the toxic effect of this drug. If you sit in a position where decisions that you take would have a serious impact on the health of people. You can't ignore a lot of experience around the world, which says this drug has these negative effects.
Why have you been so outspoken recently about greed and the pharmaceutical companies?
I think a lot of the discussion that needs to take place and an approach to health and treatment of people, it does seem indeed to be driven by profit. You probably would know this, we had a long wrangle with the pharmaceutical industry internationally about issues of parallel imports and so on. What we were saying was that we want to make medicines and drugs as affordable as is possible to what is basically largely, in South Africa, a poor population. We needed to find these medicines where they were cheapest, properly controlled, properly tested, the genuine product, no counterfeits.
In the press, you are exhorted to confine, and I quote, confine yourself to the job to which you were elected and leave specialized subjects to the taking of best available advice. That was today. What's your response?
Well, I don't imagine that heads of government would ever have the possibility to say, I'm not specialized in economics, therefore I can't take economic decisions. I'm not a soldier, therefore I can't take decisions about matters affecting the Department of Defense. Or I'm not an educationist, a pedagogue, therefore I can't take decisions about education. I don't particularly see why health should be treated as this extremely specialized thing about why the president of a country can't take health decisions. I think it would be a dereliction of duty to say, well, as far as health policy is concerned, we shall leave that matter to the doctors and the scientists. As far as education is concerned, we'll leave that matter to educationists and pedagogues. I think the argument is absurd, actually.
How do you feel about the reaction of some of your country's leading virologists and intellectuals to your position?
I get the sense that, as I was saying earlier, that we've all of us been educated into one school of thought. I'm not surprised at all that you would find, I'm quite sure, among the overwhelming majority of scientists in this field in this country, people who would hold a particular point of view because that's all they were exposed to. This other point of view, which is, I think, part of what is frightening, this alternative point of view, in a sense, has been blacked out. It must not be heard, it mustn't be seen. I mean, even that's the demand now. Why is Mbeki talking to discredited scientists, giving them legitimacy? It's a very worrying thing that anybody can say today, in today's world, that there is a point of view that is prohibited, that's banned, that they're heretics who must be burnt at the stake. And it's all said in the name of science and health. It can't be right.
Now, it has been said that the pharmaceutical industry is more powerful than governments. Are you actually going to go as far as taking this debate to other world leaders, like President Clinton, like Prime Minister Blair, or perhaps the Prime Minister of India, who has expressed his support for an investigation into these issues, as you are?
Sure, certainly, yes. I do want to raise the matter with a number of political leaders around the world, at least to inform them about what we're doing, to get them to understand the truth about this issue, not what they might see on television or read in some newspaper. And indeed, we were very encouraged to see the Indian government getting itself involved in this issue. I think the concern around the problem questions, which in a sense have been hidden, I think that concern will grow around the world. And the matter is critical because the reason we're doing all of this is to be able to respond correctly to what is reported to be a major catastrophe on the African continent. We have to respond correctly and urgently. And you can't say respond correctly by closing your eyes and ears to any point of view, any scientific evidence that is produced. A matter that seems to be very clear in terms of the alternative view that is being presented is, what do you expect to happen in Africa with regard to immune systems, where people are poor, subjected to repeated infections, and all of that? Surely you would expect these immune systems to collapse. And I've no doubt that that is happening. But then to attribute such immune deficiency to a virus produces a specific response. And what we're discussing here as the South African government is that it seems incorrect to respond to this AIDS challenge within a narrow band. If we only said there's a virus, safe sex, use a condom, end of story, we won't stop the spread of AIDS in this country.
South Africa's children will benefit from the work of President Mbeki's expert panel, and health workers like Sister Maria Nukeri at Alexandra Clinic look forward to the findings.
I believe what the step that the state president has taken pertaining to this panel that has to look into the whole arena of HIV is most welcomed, because from that, I believe we'll have a clear mandate as to the way forward.